There's a particular kind of pain that comes from being laughed at by people who should know better. Not strangers, not enemies, the people who share your water, your road, your sky. The ones who wave at you on Sunday and whisper about you on Monday. Most men, when they feel that kind of laughter cutting into them, they change. They buy a horse. They wear a different hat. They become something the town can swallow without choking. Aurelio Vasquez did not do that. He kept riding his donkey. And I, a man who kept a field journal for no reason other than that my hands shake when I'm nervous and writing steadies them. I watched the whole thing unfold from the edge of a town that didn't deserve what it was about to receive. I've written about Apache war parties. I've written about floods that swallowed 3 ranches in a single afternoon. I've written about men who did enormous things and asked for nothing in return. But I've never written about a man who did the most important thing anyone in the San Marcos Valley had ever done, and did it on the back of a donkey named Pequeño, while half the town was still laughing. This is that story. I started keeping a field journal the summer my father died and left me his ranch, his debt, and a piece of advice I've never been able to shake. Mij, the most dangerous thing in any valley isn't drought or Apache or flood. It's the man who decides he already knows everything he needs to know. I was 26 when he said that. I wrote it down that same night, not because I thought I'd forget it, but because writing things down is the only way I've ever been able to hold on to anything that matters. My hands shake. They've always shaken, a tremor in the right hand that my mother called a gift from God and my ranch hands called a liability. When I'm uneasy or tired or standing in the presence of something I don't yet understand, the shaking gets worse. So I write. I fill pages with observations and weather notes and things overheard at the feed store, and somewhere in all of it, I find the shape of what's actually happening around me. The San Marcos Valley in the summer of 1887 was the kind of place that looked beautiful from a distance and punished you for getting closer. The mesquite was thick that year, thicker than anyone could remember, which meant good grazing but also cover for things you'd rather see coming. The Pecos River ran low and brown. The sky was enormous and mostly cloudless, which sounds like a blessing until you've spent 3 weeks under it without a drop of rain, and you start to understand that an enormous empty sky is just another word for indifference. The town of San Marcos itself had maybe 300 people on a good day, 400 if you counted the ranchers who came in on Saturdays. It had one general store, one saloon, one church that served 3 denominations in rotation, a livery stable that smelled exactly like you'd expect, and a main street long enough to feel like a real town and short enough to remind you it wasn't. And it had Aurelio Vasquez. I first saw him on a Wednesday morning in early July, which I know because I wrote the date in my journal the moment I spotted him coming down the main street. Not because he was remarkable looking. He wasn't, not in the conventional sense. He was a stocky man, maybe 45 years old, with a wide brown face that had been in the sun long enough to become part of it. His clothes were clean but not new. He wore a hat that had lost its shape somewhere in the last decade and hadn't gotten it back. He had thick hands that moved with a kind of deliberate patience, like a man who had learned not to waste motion. He was riding a donkey. Not a mule, not a horse. A donkey, a smallish gray one with a white muzzle and ears so disproportionately long they seemed to belong to a larger, more optimistic animal. The donkey moved at its own pace, which was slower than everything else on the street and seemingly indifferent to any request to hurry. Aurelio rode him with his back straight and his hands loose on the reins, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. It was not, apparently, the most natural thing in the world to the people of San Marcos. I watched from the porch of the general store, my journal open in my lap, my shaking hand already moving. Not because I knew something was about to happen, but because things were already in progress, and I had learned to trust that instinct. 3 men were leaning against the post outside the saloon. I didn't know their names yet. I would learn them later. For now, they were just 3 men with the particular posture of people who had nothing to do and had elevated doing nothing into a kind of occupation. The tallest one, a lean fellow with a red bandana around his throat, spotted Aurelio first. He said something to the other 2. The other 2 laughed. It wasn't a quiet laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh that stays between 3 men and a porch post. It was the kind of laugh that reaches across a street like a hand grabbing you by the collar. Aurelio did not stop writing. He did not look at them. He guided the donkey, Pequeño, I would later learn the animal's name, to the hitching post outside the general store, dismounted with the economy of movement that suggested he'd done it 10,000 times, tied the lead rope with a knot that was neither showy nor sloppy, and walked inside without a backward glance. "Lord Almighty," the man with the red bandana said, loud enough for anyone within 30 feet to hear. "That fool came in on a jackass again." I wrote it down, word for word. I don't know why, habit maybe, or the same instinct that makes you want to document a thing before it disappears. Inside the general store, I followed, because I needed lamp oil, and because my hands were shaking in the particular way they do when something is worth watching. Aurelio was already at the counter, talking to Marta Delgado, who ran the store since her husband had passed 2 winters ago. She was a small, efficient woman who treated everyone with the same brisk courtesy and kept meticulous records of credit. She and Aurelio were speaking in Spanish, which I understood well enough. My father had made sure of that, though I hung back near the oil barrels and pretended to examine labels. Aurelio was asking about flour prices. He was comparing the price of a 20-pound sack this month versus last. He did it without complaint, the way a man asks about something that simply needs to be known. Marta told him the price had gone up 2 cents. He nodded, said something quietly that made her smile briefly, something about the weather, I think, something dry and understated, and began counting out coins. His hands were steady. I noticed that specifically because mine were not. He counted each coin with complete attention, and when he was done, he slid them across the counter in a single neat motion. I bought my lamp oil. I went back out to the porch. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched Aurelio Vasquez come into San Marcos 6 more times. I know because I logged every visit. He came for supplies, always buying practical things in modest quantities. He came once to pick up a piece of tack that Hector at the livery had repaired for him. He came once just to stand outside the post office for 20 minutes, which puzzled me until I realized he was probably waiting to see if there was a letter. And when he finally went in and came out again with nothing in his hands, his face didn't change, but his pace back to Pequeño was slightly faster than usual, the way a man moves when he doesn't want anyone to see that something has landed on him. Every time he came, the men outside the saloon had something to say. It was never the same thing twice, which suggested a creativity to their cruelty that I found, in a dark corner of myself, almost impressive. They called him a fool. They called Pequeño names I won't repeat here. They made jokes about pride, about poverty, about what it said about a man that he couldn't keep a horse. Once, when Aurelio was walking past with his flour sack over one shoulder, the man with the red bandana, whose name I had by now learned was Clifton Burrell, a fact I will return to, stepped partially into the street and said, loud and clear, "You know, Vasquez, if you put that much dignity into getting yourself a real horse, you might actually be somebody." Aurelio stopped. I held my pen. He turned and looked at Clifton Burrell with an expression I've been trying to describe ever since and never quite managed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't the tightened jaw of a man suppressing something violent. It was more like recognition. The way you look at something you've seen before and already made your accounting of. A kind of tired clarity that was worse, I think, than anger would have been, because anger at least gives the other person something to respond to. He said in English that was accented but precise, "Pequeño gets me there, gets me home, that's enough for me." Then he finished crossing the street, loaded his flour, untied his donkey, and rode out of town at exactly the same pace he'd arrived. Clifton Burrell laughed. His friends laughed. A couple of people on the street smiled in that helpless, collaborative way people smile when the crowd makes it easy. I wrote it all down, every word. My hand shaking badly enough that my handwriting was almost illegible, though I could still read it when I went back later. What I wrote at the bottom of that page was not an observation. It was a question, which was unusual for me. What does he know that they don't? It took me another week to find out where Aurelio Vasquez lived, and what, exactly, he did. In a town of 300 people, the information wasn't hard to come by once I started asking, though I quickly learned that most people asked the wrong questions about him. They asked why he didn't get a horse. They asked how he could stand the mockery. They asked if he had any pride at all. These were not, I had come to understand, the right questions. The right question was the one I'd written in my journal. What did he know that they didn't? He lived on a small property about 6 miles north of town. in the direction of the canyon country where the terrain got complicated and beautiful in equal measure, where the mesas stepped up in shades of orange and red, where the arroyos cut deep and sudden, where the water ran underground and surfaced in places that only the very old or the very patient knew to look for. He had about 40 acres, mostly rocky, with a spring-fed tank on the eastern edge that had never gone dry in living memory. He ran a small herd of goats. He kept a kitchen garden that, given the soil and the water situation, was producing things by pure stubbornness. He had been on that land for 22 years. He had come from Chihuahua, originally, or his parents had, and he had been born on the journey, or shortly after, depending on which account you believed. He had built his house himself, stone by stone, which was why it was still standing while two of his neighbors' wooden structures had blown down or rotted in the years since. He had a wife who had died 8 years ago. Her name had been Rosario. He had a son who had gone north to find work in Colorado, from whom he received letters approximately twice a year. He had a daughter who had married a man in El Paso and sent him drawings made by his grandchildren, 3 of them now, whose names he knew but who did not know his face. He had Pequeño, who was 17 years old and had been with him longer than most of the alliances in his life. This was the man they called a fool. I want to be careful here about what I'm saying, because I don't want to overstate it the way people tend to overstate things in retrospect, once the shape of a story becomes clear, and the temptation is to make everyone either a prophet or a villain from the beginning. Aurelio Vasquez was not a saint. He was not a prophet. He was a man who had made certain decisions about his life, and carried them forward with more consistency than most people manage, and who had developed, through those 22 years of steady living, a specific and particular knowledge of the land around San Marcos that nobody else possessed in quite the same form. That was what I was beginning to understand when I finally rode out to his property on a Wednesday afternoon, with my journal in my saddlebag, and a reasonable pretext about asking whether he'd seen the Arroyo Seco's water level change recently. I was trying to understand the water situation for an article I was writing for a paper in Austin, and that part was actually true. He was in his garden when I arrived. He was working with a short-handled hoe, the kind that keeps you bent close to the earth, and he straightened up when he heard my horse coming and looked at me with the same steady expression he'd turned on Clifton Burrell, which made me briefly wonder if I'd made a mistake coming. But he waved once with the hoe in a gesture that was neither warm nor cold, just the acknowledgement of a man who had been seen and didn't intend to pretend otherwise. "Mr. Vasquez," I said, dismounting, "my name is Cal Reyes. I'm a rancher and I write occasional pieces for—" "Sit down," he said, nodding toward a wooden bench near the house wall. "Water's in the bucket there." It wasn't an invitation so much as a decision about the conversation's direction. I sat down. I drank water from the ladle in the bucket, which was cold in a way I hadn't expected given how warm the day was, and I realized the bucket was sitting in shadow against the north-facing wall, something I wouldn't have thought to do. He finished what he was doing in the garden before he came to sit across from me on an upturned crate. He didn't hurry. When he sat down, he took off his hat and held it by the brim, turning it slowly, not the nervous fidgeting I recognized in myself, but more like a man giving his hands something to do while his mind settled. "You want to ask about the Arroyo," he said. "Among other things," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "What other things?" I opened my journal. My hand was shaking. He looked at it, just a glance, not rude, just noticing, and then looked back at my face. "I've been watching you come into town," I said. "I've been watching the way you handle yourself, and I've been wondering—" I stopped, rephrased. "You know what people say about you?" "Yes." "It doesn't seem to bother you." He turned the hat around once. "It bothers me." That was not what I'd expected. I wrote it down. "But," he said, "a man who lets other people decide how he gets from one place to another, that's a man who's already lost something he can't get back." He paused. "Pequeño is a good animal. He's honest. He doesn't ask for more than he needs. He knows this land." Another pause. "Same as me." I wanted to ask him what he meant about knowing the land, but something in his expression suggested the conversation was moving at its own pace and would get there when it got there. So instead I asked about the Arroyo. And what he told me for the next hour was the most precise and unsettling account of the water situation in the San Marcos Valley that I had ever heard. He described changes he'd been tracking for 3 years. He described the way the spring under his property pulsed differently in the weeks before a significant rain event, not the rain itself, but the underground pressure that preceded it, which he'd learned to feel through the rhythm of the tank's overflow. He described the behavior of the canyon system to the north, which he knew on foot and on donkeyback from 20 years of moving through it slowly enough to learn it. He described a particular shelf of rock above the town's eastern side that had been undermining, he believed, for the better part of a decade, and that was going to become a serious problem if it ever coincided with enough water moving through the system at once. I wrote all of it down. When I rode home that evening, my hand was shaking worse than usual, but it wasn't anxiety. It was something else, the particular tremor that comes when I've been given more information than I know how to hold, and my body is trying to manage the weight of it. I didn't know, riding back in the long summer dusk, that in 9 days the canyon was going to open up like a fist unclenching, and every piece of knowledge Aurelio Vasquez had been accumulating for 2 decades was going to be the only thing standing between San Marcos and something irreversible. But I wrote down what he told me, and I kept the journal in my saddlebag where it always was. And my hand, for reasons I didn't fully understand yet, did not stop shaking for the rest of that week. The thing about Clifton Burrell that I learned in those final days before everything changed was that he wasn't a bad man in any simple sense. This is the part of the story that's hardest to tell, because it would be easier if he were simply a villain, a man whose cruelty came from a dark place and needed no further explanation. But Clifton Burrell had come to San Marcos 4 years ago from West Texas with a wife and a small stake of money and real ambitions about the land here. His wife had died in the 2nd year, fever, like so many, and the ambitions had dried with her, curled inward, become something smaller and harder. He was a man who had lost the future he'd been building toward and hadn't found a different one to build toward instead. So he stood outside the saloon and he said cutting things, and the people who laughed with him were, I think, mostly laughing at the particular relief of finding a target that wasn't them. I'm telling you this not because it excuses anything. It doesn't. I'm telling you because understanding it matters for what happens next, for the choice Clifton Burrell makes, which is the most morally complicated thing I saw in the whole of that summer, and which my journal records in handwriting that is almost illegible from the shaking. It was the 4th day of July when the rain started. Not the gentle rain that the valley needed and had been waiting for. A soaking, reasonable rain that would fill the tanks and green the grass and let everyone breathe. This was the kind of rain that comes out of a sky that has been holding its breath for too long and finally decides all at once to be done with it. It started in the afternoon, and it didn't stop. By evening, the main street was running ankle-deep. By midnight, the Picos was moving in a way that sounded different from normal water, a lower register, a kind of grinding that I could feel in my chest more than hear with my ears. I was in my room above the saloon, where I'd taken temporary lodging while I finished my article. I was awake because the rain had woken me, and I was at the window with my journal, writing weather observations, when I saw a shape coming down the main street through the dark and the rain. A man on a donkey, moving at the fastest pace I'd ever seen Pequeño move. I had my boots on before I was consciously aware of having reached for them. This is something I've thought about many times in the years since, the way the body sometimes knows before the mind does. Not instinct exactly, and not experience exactly, but something in the accumulated knowledge of living that functions faster than thought. I was at the window. I saw Aurelio Vasquez riding through the rain on Pequeño in a way that wasn't his normal way, and my boots were on before I understood why I was putting them on. I had been keeping a running note in my journal of the weather as it developed, because this was the kind of event that could become significant, and because my hands shake when I'm anxious and writing steadies them. By the time I got the notes down that night, my handwriting was worse than usual, not from shaking, but from the cold and the wet, and from the particular unsteadiness of a man who is moving while he writes, which is not recommended, but which I've never been able to stop doing when events are in motion. I went down the saloon stairs 2 at a time, which I mention because I'm not, by nature, a fast-moving person. My father used to say I moved through life the way you read a difficult book, slowly, with frequent stops to reread the last passage. But I went down those stairs 2 at a time, and I hit the street in the rain with my journal under my coat and my hat pulled down hard, and I was running toward Aurelio before I'd made any conscious decision about it. He had pulled Pequeno up in front of the saloon, which was still lit. It was a Saturday, technically now Sunday, and there were still 8 or 9 men inside. He was off the donkey before the animal had fully stopped, and there was something in the way he moved, controlled speed, no wasted motion, the efficiency of a man who has rehearsed something so many times in his mind that when it finally happens, his body already knows the sequence, that made me stop moving and simply watch for a moment. His face, when I got close enough to see it in the light spilling from the saloon windows, was wet from rain and something else. Not tears, I want to be precise about this. It was the expression of a man who had seen something large happening and had run toward it instead of away from it, and who was now dealing with the cost of that choice in real time, in his face, in the set of his shoulders. He went through the saloon door without slowing down. I followed him in. There were 8 men at the bar or the tables. Most of them looked up with the particular expression of men interrupted mid-drink, a combination of annoyance and alertness, the face you make when the outside world has come inside where it wasn't invited. Clifton Burrell was there, standing at the far end of the bar with a glass in his hand, and I watched his expression go through something complicated when he saw who had just walked in. Aurelio didn't waste time on the room. He looked at the bartender, a man named Pete Ordonez who had a reputation for being unflappable, and said in English loud enough for everyone, "The North Shelf is going. I've been watching it move for 2 hours. The water is already behind it. When it goes, it's going to come down through the east draw and hit the lower quarter of town before anyone knows it's coming." The room was quiet for about 3 seconds, which doesn't sound like a long time but feels like it when you're standing in it. Then someone at one of the tables said, "Is this the jackass man?" And someone else laughed, the automatic laugh, the reflexive one, the laugh that doesn't require thought because it's already been used so many times it runs without fuel. I looked at Clifton Burrell. His glass was still in his hand. His expression had gone strange, not the mocking thing I'd seen on him before, but something more complicated and less comfortable. Aurelio didn't look at the man who'd laughed. He looked at Pete Ordonez. "I know this land," he said. It was said simply, without emphasis, the way you state something that is so thoroughly true it doesn't require a particular tone. "I have been watching the pressure under the North Face since March. I know what it does when this much water moves through the system above. Pete, you need to move people out of the lower quarter. You need to do it now before the shelf gives." Pete Ordonez was, as I said, unflappable. He looked at Aurelio for a long moment with the focused attention of a man who is taking something seriously, because the person in front of him is taking it seriously. He was not, I noted, laughing. "How much time?" Pete said. "I don't know," Aurelio said. "It could be an hour, it could be less." Another voice from the tables. "He doesn't even know, he's just a crazy old." "How many people in the lower quarter?" Aurelio said, still looking at Pete, cutting through the voice with the simple efficiency of a man who has decided not to spend any more of his attention in that direction. Pete said, "The Garza family, the widow Montoya, Hector from the livery, he lives in the back of the stable. The Connolly kids are staying with their aunt in the old Ray's building." He paused. "Maybe 15 people total." "The Connolly kids," Aurelio said. Something shifted in his expression at those words. Not dramatically, not the big visible shift of a story's emotional turning point, but something small and internal, the kind of thing you only catch if you're close enough and paying attention. 4 words. Their weight was the weight of a specific decision being made. I was writing. My hand was shaking hard enough that I could feel it in my elbow. "I'll start with the Connolly kids," Aurelio said. "Pete, you take the Garza family." "Someone else?" He looked around the room, and now he did look at the people who had been laughing, not with anger but with the flat expectation of a man who has work to do and needs to know if there's going to be help or not. "Someone else gets Hector and the widow Montoya." The room was quiet. Clifton Burrell set down his glass. I noted it in my journal. Burrell sets glass down, doesn't say anything, stands up straight. Then Burrell said, to no one in particular but loud enough for everyone, "I know where the widow Montoya lives." What happened in the next 45 minutes I can account for partly from my own witness and partly from accounts I gathered afterward, because I was moving through the dark and the rain and couldn't see everything at once. I'm a rancher and a writer, not a hero. I want to be clear about that. I went toward the Ray's building where the Connolly children were staying, not because I'm brave, but because I was already moving and it was on the way, and Aurelio had already gone ahead of me, and there are moments when you simply don't stop. The rain was extraordinary, not the kind of rain you describe with adjectives, not torrential or relentless, because those words have been used too often to carry weight. It was rain the way a wall is a wall, solid, consistent, non-negotiable. It pressed against you. It changed the sound of everything. The street that had been running ankle-deep when I looked out my window was now past my boot tops, and the water was moving, not pooling, moving with direction and purpose, which meant it was going somewhere. I knew where it was going. Aurelio was ahead of me by perhaps 40 yards, Pequeno moving through the water with the sure-footed deliberateness of an animal that has navigated this specific terrain in many different conditions and has a memory for it. I found this later to be the detail that struck me most. Looking back, that Pequeno's familiarity with the ground was as much a part of what saved people that night as anything else. A horse might have panicked in that moving water. A horse might have shied from the sound of the stone working loose above the canyon. Pequeno moved through the dark, in water past his fetlocks, as if he'd been asked to do something reasonable. The Rays building was an old two-story structure at the southeastern edge of the lower quarter, which meant it was closer to the draw than most. The Connolly children were 3 of them, 8, 6, and 4, 2 boys and a girl, staying with their Aunt Helen while their parents were in El Paso for a week. Helen Connolly was a practical woman who had been awake and was already dressed when Aurelio pounded on her door, which saved time. I was there for this part. I saw it. She opened the door with a lamp in her hand and looked at Aurelio, then at me, then back at Aurelio and said, "It's the North Shelf, isn't it?" Not a question. He said yes. She turned around, set the lamp on a table, and woke her children in the particular brisk, matter-of-fact way that some mothers have in emergencies, not frightening them, not minimizing it, just creating forward motion. Within 5 minutes, all 3 children were in coats and boots, the 8-year-old carrying the 6-year-old on his back because his sister had always been afraid of water and the street outside was moving. Helen had a bag. She had the children's documents in the bag. She had, I noticed, done this kind of thinking in advance. I carried the 4-year-old. I'm telling you this not for credit, but because it's in my journal and the journal is the account. I carried him through the water in the dark, and he didn't cry, and I still don't know if that was because he was too frightened to cry or because he trusted that the adults around him knew what they were doing. We moved uphill to the church, which was the highest ground in town and where other people were already beginning to gather. Pete Ordonez had gotten to the Garza family quickly, and they were already there, the Garza parents and their 5 children, all of them soaked, most of them holding each other with the specific tightness of people who aren't sure yet how frightened to be. Clifton Burrell brought the widow, Montoya. I saw him come through the door with her. She was in her 70s, a small woman, and he had her by the arm and was walking at her pace, which was not fast. His face was soaked, and his boots left puddles every step. He brought her to a pew near the front and helped her sit down, and then he stood there for a moment with his wet hands at his sides, looking at her, and then he looked across the church at Aurelio, who was in the back counting heads. Their eyes met. I wrote it down, though I couldn't find words for what passed between them. I still can't fully, but I wrote, Burrell looks at Vasquez, doesn't say anything, nods once. Vasquez nods back, both look away. Hector the liveryman came in last, coughing. He'd gotten his horses out before he'd gotten himself out, which was so completely in character with everything I'd heard about him that it didn't surprise anyone. Then we waited. Aurelio sat near the church door. He had refused a dry coat that someone offered him. He sat with his back to the wall and his wet hat in his hands, turning it slowly. The same thing I'd seen him do that first day at his property, that deliberate give something to the hands motion, and he was listening. I sat near him. My journal was open on my knee. My hand was shaking enough to make writing difficult, but I was doing it anyway. How did you know? I asked him. How long have you known? He thought about the question for a moment before answering it, which I'd come to understand was his habit. He didn't answer things reflexively. He answered them only when he was ready to be precise. March, he said. I started hearing it in March, a sound not loud, just different, underground. The spring started running different. He paused. My wife used to say that land has memory. It remembers every rain that's ever come through. When you know it long enough, you can hear it thinking about the old ones. I wrote this down. And you told people, I said. It wasn't a question, I could read it in him. He had told people. I told the land office, I told the county, I wrote a letter to Austin. He was quiet for a moment. They were polite about it. They said there was no data to support. He stopped, started again. I'm a man who rides a donkey. My handwriting is not good. My letter looked like the letter of a man who rides a donkey. I looked down at my own journal, at my shaking handwriting, and I didn't say anything for a moment. How many times did you try? I asked. He looked up at the ceiling, old pine boards, water stains in the corners, a single lamp. March, April, 2 letters in May. I went to the county seat in June. He paused. Pequeno made the trip in 2 days, good animal. Outside, the rain was doing something different, not getting louder, getting lower. The pitch of it was dropping, which meant the volume of water had changed, which meant. We all felt it before we heard it. Not a crash, not the roar you'd expect from a structure as large as that shelf of rock. It was more like the world taking a very deep breath and then sighing, a low, sustained vibration that came up through the floor of the church and through the soles of my feet and through the hand I had pressed flat on the journal page. The children in the pews grabbed their parents. The lamp swayed. Helen Connolly put both arms around all 3 of her niece and nephews simultaneously, which didn't quite work, but was an admirable geometric attempt. And then the sound came, the real sound, the one that followed the vibration by maybe 4 seconds, a grinding, rushing, enormous sound from the direction of the east draw, and then the lower register rumbling of a very large amount of displaced material finding its final position. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. In the silence that followed, I could hear the widow Montoya praying in Spanish. I could hear one of the Garza children crying, not in terror, just the kind of crying that happens when the body has been holding tension and it's suddenly given permission to release. I could hear water still moving, but differently now, finding new paths around the debris, redistributing, the valley reorganizing itself around what had just happened. Aurelio stood up. He walked to the door and opened it. He stood in the doorway with the rain on him and looked toward the eastern edge of town, and I came to stand beside him. The lower quarter of San Marcos was under about 3 feet of water and several hundred tons of dislodged earth and rock. The buildings were dark shapes in the darkness. The old Ray's building, where the Connolly children had been sleeping 2 hours before, had its front wall pushed in by debris. Even in the dark, I could see that. Aurelio stood in the doorway for a long moment. He said very quietly so that only I could hear, I didn't know it would be tonight. I've been watching for 3 months and I didn't know it would be tonight. I looked at him. When you came to my place, he said, I told you what I knew. I didn't know if anyone was listening. He stopped. I didn't know if it mattered. I thought about all the things I might say here, and I didn't say any of them, because none of them were more true than what had already happened. The 15 people behind us in the church, the children asleep on each other's shoulders in the front pew, the widow Montoya still murmuring her prayer. I wrote it in my journal instead, all of it. The sound, the vibration, the 30 seconds, and then Aurelio's words in quotation marks because they were too precise to rephrase. I didn't know it would be tonight. I've been watching for 3 months and I didn't know it would be tonight. Below that I wrote, he had been trying to give this information to someone for 4 months. The land office didn't listen. The county didn't listen. The letter to Austin didn't get a response. He kept watching anyway. He came in on a donkey on the worst night of the year in the dark through water that was moving, and he went to the saloon because that's where the people were. And then I wrote below that, Pequeno is tied to the post outside. He is fine. The night stretched long and strange after that. People slept in the church in wet clothes or borrowed dry ones. Pete Ordonez made coffee on the church's small wood stove, which involved an argument about whether this was appropriate and ended with everyone having coffee. Helen Connolly's youngest fell asleep with his head on her lap and his boots still on. Clifton Burrell sat in a pew in the back, alone, not talking to anyone, staring at the floor. I moved through the church quietly, writing. I had filled 11 pages by then. My hand had stopped shaking. Around 3 in the morning, Aurelio came back inside from where he'd been standing at the door. He walked past Clifton Burrell's pew. I was watching because I'd been watching everything because that's what I do. Burrell said without looking up, I'll say it. Aurelio stopped. I don't know if it means anything, Burrell said, still not looking up, talking to the floor or his own hands or some middle distance. But I'll say it. He looked up. I'm sorry, not just for tonight, for all of it. Aurelio looked at him for a moment. Why didn't you get a horse? Burrell said, and his voice was genuinely asking this time, not mockery, not edge, just a man who actually wanted to understand something. Aurelio said, I had enough. He walked to the front of the church and sat down near the door again with his wet hat in his hands, and he turned it slowly, and he didn't say anything else. I wrote it all down. I don't think, sitting there in that wet church at 3 in the morning, that I knew yet what I was watching. I was too close to it. But I had the notes, and my hand had stopped shaking, and somewhere outside in the rain, Pequeno was tied to a post, patient and unremarkable, waiting for a man who always came back for him. The morning after is always the hardest part to write about. Not because what happened was complicated. In some ways it was very simple, in the way that mornings after terrible nights are often simple, stripped down to the essential inventory. Who is here, who is not, what has been lost, what remains. No, the difficulty is something else. The morning after gives you the full accounting, and the full accounting includes things you'd prefer to overlook, costs that the relief of survival initially obscures, questions that a night of shared fear temporarily suspends, but daylight eventually asks again. I was up before most people, because I am always up before most people. My sleeping has always been shallow, another thing my mother attributed to God and my ranch hands attributed to coffee, and in the aftermath of large events, I stopped sleeping altogether, not from anxiety but from the opposite of it, a kind of heightened attention that won't stand down because it senses there is still more to see. I sat on the church steps in the early light with my journal, and I watched San Marcos reassemble itself. The rain had stopped somewhere around 4 in the morning. The sky by 6 o'clock was that specific shade of pale gray that comes before color returns to the world. A held-breath sky, not quite ready to commit to any particular weather, the kind that makes everything look provisional. The water in the streets had receded somewhat, though the main street still ran in 2 parallel channels along the wagon wheel ruts, and the lower quarter was mud and debris, and the particular smell of things that have been wet and then disturbed. Earth, stone, old wood, the mineral edge of rainwater. I wrote day after, 6:12 a.m. by my watch, light is gray-white, 15 people slept in the church, all present. That last part, all present, was the thing I needed to write first before anything else. Aurelio had already left by the time I took my count. I saw Pequeno's place at the hitching post, and the donkey was gone, and the rope was neatly coiled on the post, not dropped, not wrapped around the rail hastily, but coiled, which was such a precise and deliberate act of consideration that I stopped and looked at it for a moment before writing it down. He had, apparently, also left behind something else. Marta Delgado found it when she went to open her store at 7 and discovered a folded paper tucked under the door. A list, written in the cramped, careful handwriting I recognized from the way Aurelio counted coins at the counter, of everything he believed needed immediate attention in the lower quarter. Which structures were compromised, which were likely salvageable, the specific flow path of the debris slide, and where the debris had settled in relation to the water table, and what that meant for the Garza family's root cellar, which he believed was now at risk of water infiltration unless the east-facing drainage ditch was cleared within 48 hours. Marta brought it to Pete Ordonez. Pete read it again, and then walked to the door of his establishment and stood there for a moment looking in the direction of the North Road, as if he were trying to see 6 miles of country at once. I know all this because Marta told me, and I wrote it down. What I witnessed myself was what happened when the town fully woke up. People carry guilt differently. I've had enough years watching people to have developed a fairly reliable taxonomy of how they respond when they owe something they can't simply pay off. Some people become angry. The owing feeling is uncomfortable enough that they convert it almost chemically into something that feels more manageable. They find a way to make the debt smaller, or to find reasons why it wasn't quite as large as it appeared, or to locate some compensating fault in the person they owe. I've seen it dozens of times and I understand it, though I don't admire it. Some people become overgenerous in a way that's about their own discomfort more than the other person's need. They throw themselves into giving, but what they're actually trying to do is pay off the account as fast as possible to get back to equilibrium, which isn't really the same as reckoning with what happened. And some people, The ones worth watching go quiet and go to work. The men from the saloon, not all 8 of them, but 5, including Clifton Burrell, were in the lower quarter by 7:30 with shovels and timber and no particular fanfare. I saw them from the street. They were working on the Garza family's drainage ditch. They were working with the specific focused silence of men who have been loud about something and are now choosing a different register. Burrell was the one who knew, apparently, where to get additional timber. There was a supply at the ranch of a man named Whitfield, 7 miles out, and Burrell had a relationship with Whitfield that the others didn't. He rode out and came back with a wagon load of it before 10 o'clock. I did not see them speak to each other much. I did not see them congratulate themselves. They worked, and when a thing was done, they moved to the next thing on Aurelio's list, because someone had made copies of Aurelio's list, and the copies were circulating through the people working in the lower quarter like a small and very practical piece of scripture. The Connolly children were there, all 3 of them with Helen, and they were also working. The 8-year-old helping shift small debris away from doorways. The 6-year-old carrying messages between the adults because she was fast and apparently had no fear of mud. The 4-year-old who I had carried through the water the night before standing next to a pile of rubble eating something and watching everything with enormous dark eyes. I stopped near him and said, "What are you eating?" He showed me. It was a biscuit that had, somehow, survived the night in his coat pocket. He looked at the biscuit, then at me, then offered me half of it with complete seriousness. I took it, my hand was steady. Around noon, with the sun finally showing itself with appropriate embarrassment after the night's events, a group of people from town rode out to Aurelio's property. I was in the group. I had attached myself to it after Pete Ordonez described what he was planning, which was to offer Aurelio the use of the county's supply wagon, a timber allocation from the county stores, and an invitation to present his survey of the Northern Canyon Formation to the county board. This last item was the one that had taken the most negotiation, based on what Pete told me, and I was not party to those negotiations. What I understood was that someone had contacted the county land office by telegram that morning, and the county office had responded with a combination of contrition and bureaucratic self-preservation that Pete had managed to navigate into something useful. Pete led the group. There were 6 of us on horses with the supply wagon behind. I had my journal. I always have my journal. The road to Aurelio's property was better than I remembered it from my first visit. He had maintained it in the years he'd been there, grading the worst sections by hand, which was another thing I only understood when I thought about the accumulated patience of someone who has decided to know a place for the long term. He was at his spring-fed tank when we came up the rise. He was checking the water level, which had risen significantly overnight. He had a stick in the water and was measuring, and he was writing something in a small notebook that I recognized as similar to my own journal, the compact, heavy paper type that survives field conditions. He looked up when he heard us coming. He straightened, he waited. Pete dismounted first and walked to him and held out his hand, and Aurelio looked at it for a moment and then shook it. Pete said, "Everyone who was in that church last night wants you to know." 15 people, Aurelio said. "Beg pardon." "There were 15 people in the lower quarter," Aurelio said. "That's the number." Pete said, "Yes, 15 people." He paused. "You probably saved all of them." Aurelio was quiet. He turned to look at his tank. The water was high enough to be running over the east lip, which he'd clearly been anticipating. He dug a channel on that side, I could see it now, a shallow trench leading the overflow away from his garden. He'd done this in advance. He'd known the overflow was coming. "I wasn't sure anyone was listening," he said. "When I came into town, I wasn't sure." Pete said, "Someone was." He glanced back at me, which I hadn't expected, and I looked down at my journal and then back up, and I realized he was right. I was someone who had been listening, which didn't make me important in the story but made me responsible for it in a way I was only beginning to understand. One of the men in the group, a rancher named Domings whom I didn't know well, said, "The county wants your survey. They want you to present it formally, what you know about the canyon." Aurelio looked at him. "Everything," Domings said. "What you've been tracking, in writing so it can go to Austin and to the territorial office." "My handwriting is not good," Aurelio said. "We'll find someone to transcribe it," Pete said. Another quiet moment. "And the rock shelf," Aurelio said. "There's more." The north face came down, but the section above the secondary draw, it's still working. It will move again maybe this year, maybe in 5 years, but it will move. He said this not with any satisfaction or vindication. He said it the way you report a measurement. This is the number, this is what it means, this is what needs to happen. I was writing. My hand was completely steady. I don't know exactly when that happened, somewhere in the ride out here, or earlier, or maybe in the middle of the night at the church. In that moment after the sound of the shelf coming down, in the silence when I'd pressed my hand flat on the journal page and felt the vibration through the paper. "I'll write it all down," Aurelio said. "What I know, the whole of it." He looked at Pete, and then at the group, and I noted this because I found it significant. He looked at Pequeno, who was tied near the water tank with his long ears oriented toward the group in the way of an animal that is paying polite attention. "Pequeno will need water first," Aurelio said, "and feed." And somehow that was both the most ordinary thing said in the last 18 hours and the most important, and I couldn't have explained why at the time, but I wrote it down. I stayed for 2 more weeks after the flood. I want to account for those weeks carefully because they contain things that are easy to sentimentalize and which I am trying very hard not to. The county survey happened. Aurelio spent 6 days writing his account of the North Canyon formation, the spring pressure readings he had been taking, the water behavior he documented over 22 years. His handwriting was indeed not good, cramped and uneven, the handwriting of a man largely self-taught, as his son had told me in a letter I received after I sent him a message describing what his father had done. But what it said was meticulous, specific, and scientifically coherent, in a way that impressed the engineer who was eventually sent from Austin to review it. I transcribed the handwritten notes into my own clearer script, which is something I hadn't offered to do but which Aurelio eventually asked me to do on the 3rd day of his writing, when we were sitting at his table, and he had been watching my hand move across the page, and he said, without preamble, "You write fast when you're not nervous." I said, "I'm not nervous right now." He nodded and pushed his notes toward me. I transcribed everything. The Connolly children came out to the property once with Helen to thank him. The 4-year-old, whose name was James, had apparently developed a significant attachment to Pequeno over the course of that single terrifying night, based on some brief interaction I had not witnessed, and he asked immediately upon arrival whether he could see the donkey. Aurelio took him to the water tank and let him stand next to Pequeno, and the donkey was very patient about being examined at length by someone considerably shorter than was probably comfortable. James asked, "What's his name?" Aurelio said, "Pequeno." James tried the word. He got it approximately right. He looked at the donkey for a moment, then at Aurelio. "Why Pequeno?" James said. Aurelio said, "He was small when I got him. He's not anymore." He paused. "But the name stayed." I wrote this down from a distance of about 10 feet, which is close enough to hear something said quietly. My hand moved across the page at the speed it moves when I'm not nervous. Clifton Burrell came to the property also alone on a Thursday afternoon. I was there, but I was inside the house transcribing notes, and I didn't go out. I could hear the conversation through the open window, and I wrote what I heard, and I will report it here as accurately as I can. Burrell started with something practical. He had a contact who might be able to get Aurelio a better price on goat feed, which was an awkward opening, but perhaps the best he had available. Aurelio said he would appreciate that. Then there was a silence, and Burrell said, "I keep thinking about what you said, when I asked why you didn't get a horse." "I had enough," Aurelio said. "Yeah," Burrell said. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that." Another silence. "I don't know if I've ever had that." I wrote it exactly as he said it. Aurelio said, "You can learn it." Burrell said, "How?" Aurelio was quiet for a moment, and I waited with my pen on the page. He said, "You stop looking at what other people have and you start looking at what the land remembers. Takes a while, but you can learn it." I could hear Burrell moving, the sound of a man shifting his weight, the creak of his boots. Then he said, "That shelf, that's still working." The section above the secondary draw. "Yes. Someone should be watching it." A pause. "Someone is," Aurelio said. The conversation ended not long after that. Practical things, feed contacts, a question about the Garza family's drainage progress. Then Burrell rode out. I heard him go. I sat at the table inside with my pen still on the page, and I didn't write anything for a while. There's a thing that happens after an event that saves people in a town that knows who saved them. The town wants to give it a shape it can hold. It wants a story with clear edges, a narrative it can repeat, a version of events that arranges the elements into something that feels earned and conclusive. They want the hero to be legible. They want the ending to be clean. San Marcos did this, as towns do. There were versions of the story that circulated in the weeks after, some more accurate than others, some more generous, a few that were generous in the wrong directions. There was a version in which Clifton Burrell played a larger role than the sequence of events quite supports, though in fairness he had moved quickly once moving, and I understand why his name featured prominently in some accounts. There was a version in which Aurelio's knowledge was presented as mysterious and somehow natural, a gift of blood or instinct, rather than what it actually was. 22 years of careful, consistent, largely unrecognized observation. I wrote the version I had seen, all of it. The Wednesday mornings, and the men outside the saloon, and the letter to Austin that didn't receive a response, and the hat turning in the hands at his property, and the vibration through the church floor and Pequeño's rope coiled on the post. The piece ran in 3 papers eventually. I'm not sure how many people read it. What I am sure of is what Marta Delgado told me the last day I was in San Marcos, when I stopped by the general store to pick up supplies for the ride home. She said that 3 weeks after the flood, she had been in conversation with Aurelio about the spring flower prices again, the same conversation they'd been having for years, and she had looked up from counting his change and said, without quite meaning to, "It's good that you came in that night." And Aurelio had looked at her and said simply, "I come in every week." And she hadn't known what to do with that, the matter-of-factness of it, the complete absence of anything that required a particular response. So she had just nodded and given him his change, and he had carried his flour to Pequeño and ridden home. I've thought about that exchange many times. The whole of what it contains, the years of coming in, the uncelebrated consistency, the thing that looks like stubbornness and is actually a form of fidelity. He came in every week. He came in when people laughed. He came in when the sky looked wrong and the underground spring was saying something nobody was listening to. He came in when the worst night in years opened up and the only useful thing he had to offer was 22 years of paying attention. He came in on a donkey. The same donkey every time. I rode out on a Saturday morning in late July, when the valley had begun to reassemble itself into something that would eventually look, from a distance, like normalcy, though the lower quarter would take months to fully clear, and the survey crew from Austin was already setting up in the North Canyon, and Clifton Burrell had apparently organized a group of 3 or 4 men who were rotating through weekly checks on the secondary draw above the shelf. Which was a piece of information I found in a letter from Pete Ordonez that reached me later. At the edge of town, heading north on the main road, I passed Aurelio coming the other way. We were going in opposite directions on the same road, which felt pointed in the way that coincidences sometimes feel pointed. Not meaningful exactly, just symmetrical enough to make you stop and look. He was on Pequeño. Of course he was on Pequeño. I stopped my horse, he stopped Pequeño. We looked at each other for a moment in the morning light, which was good light. The clean, unpretentious morning light that comes after a week of clearing weather, neither dramatic nor washed out, just itself. I said, "I'm going to write about all of this." He said, "I know. Is there anything you want me to include that I might have missed?" He thought about this for a moment, the way he always thought about things, deliberately, without hurrying. He said, "Pequeño is 17 years old. He's older than most of the horses in this valley." I wrote it down, right there on the road, with my journal balanced on my saddlebag. He said, "He knows every arroyo between here and the canyon. He's never once put a foot wrong." I wrote that too. He said, "That's worth more than people think." I said, "I'll put it in." He nodded. He guided Pequeño around my horse with the ease of long habit, and he went on down the road towards San Marcos, and I watched him go, the wide brown back, the hat that had lost its shape, the donkey's enormous patient ears catching the morning. I didn't see him again after that. What I have are my notes, 11 pages from the church, another 40 from the 2 weeks after, the transcription of his canyon survey folded inside the back cover. And one last entry, written on the road north that Saturday morning, in handwriting that my father would have recognized from 40 years ago, when he first taught me that writing things down is how you hold on to the things that matter.